understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? Time for the podcast, and it is the year, John, of the snake.
Apparently so.
Chinese New Year today, yesterday.
Yeah.
First day of the Chinese New Year today, the year of the snake, and this podcast is all China. Triggered by the news that DeepSeek, a Chinese AI company, has not only produced better OpenAI than the Americans, but has done it at 100th of the cost, completely undermining the American model. And it couldn't have come at a more interesting moment in history when the Americans are saying they're going to slap tariffs and restrictions on everybody. And this is an example of a Chinese company which out-Silicon Valley'd Silicon Valley with far less resources, which is the essential essence of innovation. Now, you will remember we were talking about Nassim Taleb's fragility. We've talked about Schumpeterian economics. We've talked about the disruptor disrupting the original disruptor. Companies that were seen as being at the forefront of technological innovation get blindsided by other companies. Countries that were seen as being at the forefront of technological innovation get blindsided by other countries. This is a great example, and it's completely thrown up people's ideas.
Completely and utterly out of the blue.
Out of the blue.
And took everyone by surprise.
And it basically frames the China-America scrap, which is the big scrap between two superpowers.
Yeah.
And it frames it in a microcosm that is kind of terrifying for the incumbent, who is America.
Yeah. It's a whole new kind of economic AI warfare, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I just have to say, last night I was a bit brain dead, and I was sitting down with some of my girls to watch Crazy Rich Asians.
I haven't seen it. I heard it.
It's fluff, but it's kind of fun.
Hey, we're all fluff. We're all fluff.
But Macca was on the phone to me going, we need to do something on this. This is a big game changer.
This is just by the way, dear listener, poor old John's life is destroyed by this podcast. Because I read something and say, oh God, we've got to do a podcast. I'd say this to John like crazy on a Monday night. We've got to get a Chinese AI expert who speaks Chinese, who's au fait with these companies. We've got to do it tomorrow, and we've got to record it in the morning. And John's like, where are you going to get that person? Well, we had just got that person.
Yes.
And she's coming up in 2 seconds.
Yes, we have. By the way, I normally walk around with a mic in my pocket just for those.
For these ambushes.
But ironically, there's a quote that pops up on the screen at the very beginning of that movie, which is so incredibly apt. And it's, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will wake the world. Who said that?
Your friend and mine.
Napoleon Bonaparte.
One of my great heroes. Yeah. One of my great
but
heroes.
It's so apt for this.
It is apt. So today we're going to talk about DeepSeek. We're going to talk about what it means for America, what it means for China, what it means for AI, what it also means is for the business model of AI. Just so I'll put it into a framework for you. Up until now, the way in which technology has evolved is it has been what you would call a winner takes all market. So it hasn't really been a competitive market. So if you take, for example, in PCs, you had Microsoft dominates, right? You had in search, you had Alphabet / Google dominates. In online retail, you had Amazon dominates. So the idea was that...
Then you had VHS and...
But if you think about these things, so over the last 10 years, the working assumption in all technological innovation, largely coming from Silicon Valley, is that the winner takes all. So all you've got to do is identify the winner and you will be quids in. And the reason is that the winner, let's say, for example, in search, take Google / Amazon, basically generates the technology. Then they generate massive investment. Then that massive investment obliterates the competition. So they get the entire market share. And you, again, we were talking about, and you rinse and repeat. So what you get is a highly concentrated owner of capital, highly concentrated ownership of the platform, and you get all the gains go to one company. So as I said, in the case of Microsoft, Microsoft took the PC market and owned the whole thing and obliterated the competition. In the case of Amazon, it took the online market, obliterated the competition, et cetera, et cetera. That was the working idea. And of course, then when the next big technology came out, AI, the working assumption was exactly the same.
Yeah.
That it would be one company would attract in all the investment, would be so far ahead of everybody else that it would obliterate the competition. So this is, you've talked about before, this is the road to monopoly. And
Yes,
Silicon
yeah.
Valley is very much part of that. Although they make this great claim about being disruptors and full of startups, but in actual fact, what happens is typically those startups get hoovered up by the main companies, and you get this extraordinary concentration of wealth, power, and influence, which we spoke about last time, in the hands of very few people, the people who were at Mr. Trump's inauguration.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Now, these Chinese guys have come in. Maybe the winner doesn't take all. Maybe the little scruffy Chinese upstart working out of the back of his or her own garage has got the technology, but also, I think much more interestingly, has got the will. Because the Americans have turned the tables on the Chinese, in a way, this has made the Chinese more incentivized to actually break the American stranglehold on technology. So young
they weren't going to
Chinese
sit
people,
back and let it all happen.
Exactly. And again, we don't have to overemphasize or re-emphasize the idea. We're not talking about Japan. We're not talking about a European country. We're talking about a country which is the most populous in the world, which is amongst the most innovative in the world, and more importantly, is the country that is accelerating at a rate.
And has been goaded and punished on
And
many
punished
levels.
and besmirched and undermined and all that sort of stuff. And then just finally, what this is a great example of is networked economics. So all research tends to be open source and network. So you're trying to get the best people, talking to the best people, creating a network. And what you found here is that in DeepSeek, so again, they have done this for $5 million. Not 500, not 50, not whatever, 5 million. And what you're seeing, this is a great example of the network is always more powerful than the vertical power structure. So the network is horizontal economics, the vertical power structure is vertical, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, John, we're going to go to Hong Kong, and we're going to talk to, actually, no, I think she's in the Philippines. Celebrating Chinese New Year, to Karen Howe, Hoe. She is an award-winning journalist who covers AI, right? And she's the first journalist ever to profile OpenAI. She's also working on a book about AI. There's nothing about AI she doesn't know. She's also Chinese, so that helps she understands the culture, the language, the whole idea. And she made the fatal mistake of putting up a post on X, stroke Twitter, last night. And I said, let's go. And she is now on the line. So let's go to the Philippines.
Brilliant.
Karen Howe, who knows all things about DeepSeek and is celebrating Chinese New Year in Philippines. Karen, how are you?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, David.
No, I'm absolutely delighted. Absolutely delighted. This is, you should warn yourself. Never put up a thread on Twitter X and think you're going to get away from it. That's what happens. You put up a thread and within 24 hours, you're on the David McWilliams podcast. You put up a thread yesterday about DeepSeek and I found it fascinating. Tell me, what is DeepSeek first and why is this changing the game?
Yeah, so DeepSeek is a Chinese company that is a really interesting backstory. They spun out of a quantitative hedge fund in China, one of the most prominent ones and most productive ones, called Highflyer, that was founded in 2015. And the founder, Liang Wenfeng, he basically had a master's in computer science, was always really interested in AI, and decided after his hedge fund got really good that he wanted to invest all of the money into developing more AI and more advanced AI. So he kind of set up a deep learning research division of the company that then became DeepSeek. And the reason why DeepSeek is suddenly in the news right now is because it's basically come out with a series of AI models in just the last couple days, few weeks, that has outperformed the leading edge models coming out of American firms like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google on several benchmarks, but done it at a fraction of the cost. So usually the models that American firms have been training, they don't really disclose the full costs, but it's on the range of like 100 million to $1 billion. And this Chinese firm was able to do it with less than $6 million. And so it is a huge upset and kind of in the AI world because it really upends a lot of the assumptions that the AI industry was operating under for several years.
So wait a sec. So we're talking about, on some metric, maybe 100th of the cost is what the Chinese...
Potentially.
Yeah, potentially
Yep.
100th of the cost, okay? And
Yeah.
this is number one. But number two, and there's an interesting backstory before we go on to what it means, is that this has been done at a time when China has been starved of American technology. And what is going on
Yes.
there? Because the Americans introduced all these chip bans against the Chinese in order to strangle the Chinese, let's say,
Yeah.
nascent industries. And what these Chinese technologists have managed to do is, with inferior tech, they've actually made a better product.
Yeah, so there's sort of two things that have been happening within the Chinese AI ecosystem that I think one of them, which is this exactly what you just said. But before we get to that, I want to also talk about the second one, which is that there has been a pretty significant upskilling of the workforce in China when it comes to AI and tech in the last few years. This has happened because of a couple reasons. Like, one is that there's just a lot more emphasis on science and technology education in China, and there's a lot more people, young students that are going to study computer science or other fields like this. And another one is that because of things like US immigration policy, the best and brightest Chinese researchers that used to go to the US to get PhDs or go to the US to work for American firms actually were not able to. So they stayed home, they started joining Chinese firms. And so there's just a general an increase in kind of the talent pool, talent capacity, talent quality of the Chinese AI ecosystem. I think that is really relevant context for then this other point, which is that what's happened in the last few years is the US has also been trying to constrain China's access to computational resources based on the dogma within the AI industry that has developed that computational resources is the key to advanced AI models. So if you can throttle China's access to computational resources, you'll be able to throttle, or at the very least, kind of handicap, slow down their AI development. And essentially, what happened was this Chinese firm, they had a really high density of talent. They hired a lot of graduates from some of the best Chinese universities, and they were able to, within those constraints, actually just break out of them. And it's not that they had necessarily incredibly unique innovations that allowed them to do this. They actually took a lot of existing techniques that had basically just been dormant within AI research that people weren't really focused on implementing. They took all of them, they executed them super well, and they also combined a lot of them, 6 to 8 of them, of these different kind of efficiency measures, so that they suddenly got this huge leap in computational efficiency, and then they were able to achieve what American firms had done with far less.
So this is what I want to focus on before we talk about the implications, which is this basic essential. We've spoken on the podcast many times about Joseph Schumpeter, the great economist. We've spoken about Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile. This is a great example of anti-fragile, where constraints make you not only more robust, but they make you actually better. So the more stuff that's thrown at you, and I suppose this comes in the management speak of basically work smarter, don't work harder, actually find these things. And in a way, this DeepSeek moment, this event, proves the idea that human creativity will always outrun dollar reserves. And by that, I mean, the Americans are now saying, well, if you don't have $1 billion, you can't pay to play. You're not in the game. And the Chinese are saying,
Yeah.
well, actually, 5 million, we can do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have a technical degree. I went to MIT for undergrad, and in engineering school, the thing that we always said was you cannot have creativity without constraint. Necessity is the mother of innovation. And the reason is because when it comes to solving a problem, if there's an easy path, which is to just throw more money at it, and a hard path, which is to use a shoestring budget to try and get really creative, of course you're going to take the easy path. You know, you don't have the existential drive to take the harder path because you don't know if the harder path is going to work. And usually for businesses, you really want the guarantee that you're going to have some kind of progress within a certain time frame because, you know, of the quarterly business cycles and things like that. So the easy path is the safe path. And within the Chinese AI ecosystem, what DeepSeek did was they didn't have access to the easy path. They didn't have the cash to just throw at it. They also didn't have the, like, no matter how much cash they throw at it, they're just not going to get those chips. They're just not going to get the increased computational resources because of geopolitics. And so they have to take the hard path. And it wasn't actually a guarantee that they would succeed. I don't think it's actually inevitable that something like DeepSeek would have happened. But I think it did. The conditions were ripe for something like this to happen because of also the fact that there is a lot of talent now in China that can do this kind of creative innovation. And therefore, we see what happened.
So just before I go to the consequences, the implication of this for Silicon Valley, for big firms like OpenAI, Nvidia, all these sort of darlings. We spoke about the Magnificent Seven on this podcast 2 weeks ago, suggesting that anything can happen when your valuations are so stretched. I feel we feel like sort of Nostradamus at this stage, John, at this stage. But I want to just very briefly ask about yourself, Karen. So you are one of the generation of Chinese who went to college in the States. Are you?
No, so I'm actually American.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Okay.
I then moved to Hong Kong to cover the Chinese tech industry. So yeah, so I sort of did the reverse of what a lot of my Chinese peers did, which is I was born in the US. I went to school, college, everything all the way up until my late 20s in the US. And then because there was a lot of exciting stuff happening within the Chinese tech industry, I thought, you know, I have the language skills, I have the cultural background to maybe do some reporting on the other side of the world. So I ended up moving to Hong Kong with the Wall Street Journal to try and understand a little bit more about what was happening with the Chinese tech industry. And that was during a time when I started noticing this thing that the talent density within China was really picking up. And there was sort of a lot of things that I think were kind of going unnoticed by Americans, in part because of the, like, you know, deeply entrenched narratives for a while in the US that China copies, it doesn't innovate, and China is behind on fundamental research, but it's better at applications. And also, frankly, because of the pandemic, because there were a lot of American tech analysts of Chinese tech that previously, before the pandemic, were regularly going to China and speaking with people there. And they just weren't able to do that anymore during the pandemic. So there was a little bit of a rupture in the communication between the people on the ground in both countries. And there was also, for China, the Chinese government was also cracking down a lot more on exchange with the US and with Americans. So, yeah, so I sort of moved to Hong Kong to cover this phenomenon. And I felt that it was a matter of time that there would be like a really fascinating breakout Chinese company. But I was surprised about DeepSeek. Like I wasn't actually anticipating it, and just the sheer degree of efficiency gains that they were able to achieve was still very surprising to me.
Well, okay, Karen, let's talk about what are the implications for the industry, for the stock market, for the environment, because Ireland has a big problem with data centers, because we were told we can only play this data game if we allow X amount of our electricity to be used in these massive data centers. This new DeepSeek changes everything. So explain, what are the implications?
Yeah, I'll start with the environment because I think this is the most interesting lesson to be learned from DeepSeek, which is that the world was introduced to AI with ChatGPT. And I think because of that, there were a lot of assumptions that people started making about what AI development should look like based on what OpenAI did with ChatGPT. And what OpenAI did was we're just going to pour all of the internet's data into this neural network, this software, and then train it on these absolutely massive data centers. And then we're going to 10x everything, 10x the amount of data, 10x the size of the data center, 10x the size of the neural network. And I think the public imagination of what AI progress meant suddenly meant just a colossal consumption of resources. And people thought, oh, we have to consume this amount of resources in order to get maybe some benefits in AI development. And
That's what
actually
I was thinking up until last night.
yeah. So, and like pre-ChatGPT, that was an idea within the AI field, the discipline. That was an idea that was introduced by OpenAI and ChatGPT. Before that, that was not at all the consensus among scientists about how to actually get progress in AI development. And because OpenAI was so successful in terms of, making a huge global bang with the release of ChatGPT, I think it just created this kind of FOMO in the entire industry to suddenly glom onto this approach. Like, we weren't thinking about it like this before, but maybe we should all think about it like this now. That kind of phenomenon. And a lot of people who were critical of this glomming on and being like, wait a minute, why are we forgetting all of the things that we used to do that were actually a lot less resource intensive? They were ignored. Like, those critics were being ignored and being framed as, naysayers that just didn't really understand what was going on. And the thing about DeepSeek is that it really now illustrates that those critics that were calling out the fact that there actually are probably many other approaches that do not require massive consumption of resources is actually one that exists and we should have been investing in. Because, I mean, the sheer size of the data centers and the amount of energy that they have to use is really having huge impacts right now on the environment and also on communities. There's been a lot of reporting on how when these data centers move into towns, and they're often rural communities, they're often really low income communities, there are multiple things that happen. First of all, the data center has to plug into the drinking water source because there's a certain level of water quality that is required to cool these data centers. So now these people are sharing their drinking water with a machine, and that threatens to hike up their drinking water prices. We're seeing more gas and coal plants being extended in their life. So that's more emissions and more air pollution for these communities, also accelerating climate change. And we're also just seeing, like, there is not enough energy on the grid in the world right now to supply the kind of ambitions of what Silicon Valley has imagined for what is required of their vision of AI development. And so DeepSeek changes things in that it kind of shows a truth that other people were saying for a long time, which is we don't actually need to consume all of these resources. And now it's plain as day, And I think the other thing that what's interesting is, like, is that now going to suddenly fundamentally change the way that the global AI industry develops? Is it going to suddenly reverse the amount of expenditure and investment going into data centers? I don't think in the short term that will happen, pessimistically, because I think in the US with the Trump administration right now, I think most likely the companies and the administration are going to be much more incentivized to try and double down on the approach and try and double down on no. Like, this is why we're actually still right about our approach. This is why we need to keep investing in scaling up data centers and so forth. But I hope that in the long term, what DeepSeek does is inspires a lot more companies or researchers that work for universities and outside of companies to actually start going back towards investing in these resource efficient methods and such that we can actually wean the AI industry off these colossal resources in the future.
Now, Karen, if DeepSeek can do what OpenAI does at 1/50th or 100th of the cost, why would I put any money into Sam Altman and his fantasies?
Sam Altman is incredibly persuasive. He's
No,
like a once in a generation.
Salesman. He's a great salesman.
Salesman.
But I mean, what I'm
Yeah.
saying is like Meta, Google, they've all put a huge amount of money into AI. Their background story was, it's going to cost us a fortune because we've got to scale up and you can't do this any cheaper. And don't worry, your money will be well used. You have the SoftBanks of this world. You told me when you worked in startups, getting money from SoftBank was like the kiss of death. I want to come back to you on that.
Yeah.
Right? So basically the whole American hype has been, we need all this cash because we can't produce AI any cheaper. The Chinese have just shown us not only can you produce it cheaper, but you can probably produce it at 100th of the cost. So why would I invest anything in America?
Yeah, I mean, so this is the argument that I'm now seeing on the street among US AI folks that are trying to justify this. They're saying, well, maybe not trying to justify whatever. They believe in their justification. They're saying, well, I bet that if DeepSeek had $500 billion of data centers, their AI models would be even more impressive. And so the argument is that we should not be decelerating our investments in these massive data centers. We should now just take DeepSeek's methodologies and supercharge it with $500 billion of data centers.
But that's only an ex post rationalization for money already committed. It's like, don't worry. I know last year you bought our stock, and I know you made this, let's say, private equity investment of yada yada yada. But don't worry, we'll find a place for your money. I mean, this is the road to bankruptcy.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think it is a remarkable effort to kind of rationalize the continuation of an approach that I think clearly is demonstrated to just not be a good one. But I also think that it needs to be taken seriously, this kind of rationalization, because there are people that are very persuasive that will be talking up this particular justification. And there are people that are going to be very persuaded. The Trump administration, I think, is going to be very persuaded by certain types of arguments for why we didn't actually make a mistake in announcing a $500 billion.
But the amazing thing is, in the first week of Trump's reign, this tiny Chinese company blows a massive hole in the logic of America First.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. And, the timing, a lot of people have been saying the timing is probably not coincidental in when DeepSeek actually decided to release or drop this bombshell of a piece of information on everyone.
Because it's like a massive two fingers to the notion that America has got a manifest destiny, which is that America can only produce this amazing research. And one of the reasons we can only do this is because we've got loads of lolly. And you don't have loads of lolly. And the Chinese have just said, man, we don't need it.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting.
And before we go, I mean, what it reminds me of is, do you remember when I was a kid, there was the arms race. And the arms race was between the Soviet Union and America. And basically the Soviets would produce unbelievable quantities of kind of shitty 1960s missiles.
Yeah.
But they stayed in the game because they just threw scale at everything.
Yeah.
And the Americans, in fairness to them, said, no, we're going to get smarter. We're going to make smarter weapons. And eventually the smarter weapons will undermine the Soviets. Could Silicon Valley be the Soviet Union of AI, given what the Chinese are doing?
Yeah, I mean, so I would first caveat by saying that I don't think that the arms race, like the AI arms race narrative, I personally don't find it a very productive one. I think it is very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. When two countries think about it as competition, they will then act more and more and more like it is a competition. But, one thing that people don't actually realize maybe is that the US AI researchers, their largest global collaborators are actually Chinese AI researchers. So there's actually a lot of collaboration and connectivity that happens across borders in really beautiful and beneficial ways in terms of, collaborating on AI for healthcare research or AI for drug discovery and things like that. Yeah, so that's kind of a side note. It's just, I don't necessarily buy into this frame of an arms race, but I do think that, someone said to me earlier today, it really feels like DeepSeek out Silicon Valley to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
where this upstart, the irony is Sam Altman is famous for saying throughout his career, startups are unique in their ability to disrupt incumbents. And basically, that's what DeepSeek did. It's an upstart. It's disrupting the incumbent, which is now OpenAI. OpenAI originally was the startup that disrupted the incumbent that was Google. And so, what goes around comes around. And now OpenAI is dealing with, or all of these American companies are kind of dealing now with a Chinese firm having learned the playbook and having just blown it out of the water. So yeah, absolutely. I do think that there is a funny reversal of roles that is happening here.
Okay, finally, before we go, and it is Chinese New Year, how has this been received in China?
I think there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of pride in receiving this news. I mean, there's a lot of curiosity because I think that even within the Chinese context, like people can be pessimistic about China, like the Chinese tech ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of equal amounts of surprise of like, oh, wow, like we do have a really pretty cool company that was able to pull this off. And there is a lot of pride of, I think that this is going to be a moment like in kind of, I guess, recent modern Chinese history, like the 2008 Beijing Olympics was like a really big moment of national pride where Chinese people felt like China was introducing itself to the world stage as a real global leader and starting to become an equal and being able to hold its own on the global stage. I sort of feel like there's a little bit of a moment here where within the AI world specifically, there is a pride of, oh, wait, like we were a company from on our soil was able to pull this off. And whereas before, Chinese AI researchers, 2 years ago, I was talking with Chinese AI researchers at a conference in Singapore who still, like, a lot of them, their dream was still to work at an American company like OpenAI because it is just the coolest company to have on your resume. I think this is a little bit of a pivotal point, an inflection point, where Chinese AI researchers are going to increasingly actually feel like, hey, like, I actually think it's really cool to work at DeepSeek or another Chinese company. Yeah, and I think that is going to have continuing effects, implications on just the way that talent flows within the global talent ecosystem and continue to strengthen China's AI ecosystem moving forward.
This has been fascinating. So, Karen, wonderful to see you. Enjoy Chinese New Year. Have fun. And we'll talk to you in the year of the snake, I believe.
Thank you so much, David.
Mac, we've said before that, this whole tech world and AI in particular is moving so fast, but I didn't expect it to move in this fast.
Exactly.
It's incredible.
Exactly.
But what does this mean? Like I was looking at the share price, not that I normally do that, but of Nvidia, one of the big...
the chip maker.
The chip makers.
This Magnificent Seven we spoke about 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
Kind of fell, I don't know, 20% or whatever it was. So what does that mean for not just Nvidia, but for all of the Magnificent Seven?
Well, I mean, again, this is a massive threat. So 2 weeks ago when we did the podcast on Are We in a Bubble? One of the things I was talking about was that a bubble is psychological portrait of an investment community rather than something which is actually nuts and bolts, valuation, etc. Right? And it's a mindset thing. And basically, remember we talked about it's like a group trip, right?
Yes.
Everyone's tripping at the same time.
Yeah.
So what happens, these fellas, remember the thing about group trip is don't wreck me bus.
Yeah.
Like, these lads have wrecked the bus, right? Okay. This is, exactly. It's like you're at a rave and someone turns off the music, okay? Like just pulls out the electricity from the plug and you're gone. So keep that in your head, right?
Yeah.
So they've kind of wrecked the buzz because what they've said is that number one, we can make it much cheaper. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, and this is back to your Nvidia, we can make AI with inferior chips because the big bet was Nvidia had the best microchips, the fastest, etc. And you needed the fastest microchips to process all the huge amount of data upon which the business case on AI was being made, which is what you need is more and more and more and more data, more and more and more and more data centers, and better and faster chips to, in effect, scrape all this data.
Yeah.
Right? And what the Chinese have done is, no, you don't need that.
Yeah.
What you need is you need to ask better questions of the technology.
Yeah.
You can use less data, but you have to program the technology to ask better questions of the data. And this is the great dilemma in everything. Do you need scale or do you need smarts? And what the Chinese have shown is they have the smarts. And that basically undermines the entire business case for A, data centers, B, the winner takes all, C, the massive amount of investment that's gone into these companies, D, as you were looking at last night, the share prices reflecting the massive amount of investment, and more interestingly, geopolitics, the case for America first. Because what they've just said to the Americans, yeah, you can sanction us. Yeah, you can tariff us. Yeah, you can basically say we can't use your...
You can switch off the music.
You can switch off the music. We're still going to dance. We're still going to rave, right? Okay? It's like a silent disco. Okay? This is the technological equivalent of a silent disco. We're all moving around in the forest, all right? So I think it has huge implications.
But it also comes on the back of Trump just announcing, what's it called? The Stargate?
So Stargate is basically a data center.
Yeah. $500 billion worth.
And the Chinese have just said we can do it for 50.
Yeah.
Which is kind of mad. But this is the essential elixir of innovation, John. Let's come back to our Schumpeterian idea.
Yeah.
That constraints make people clever.
Absolutely.
Nothing so focus your attention like a hard budget, right? When you have a soft budget, you throw all sorts of things at people money and it's fun. And I think what has happened in Silicon Valley is that all that money that has been made available to the Nvidias and the OpenAIs and all of them, the Magnificent Seven, has made them sloppy.
Yeah.
They're not hungry enough.
Well, I've always thought that, the idea of when you're under pressure and you are constrained. And when she mentioned that, it brought me back to a time when I was a sound engineer and I was doing an album on a farm in the middle of Shropshire with a band called the Immaculate Fools.
Can you imagine how much weed was smoking?
But so we had very little gear and kit.
Because you were actually in a farmhouse.
Yeah.
And things, yeah.
So what we did, we had to, as she would say, you had to squeeze every little bit of creativity out of whatever we had. And the outcome was brilliant. 6 months.
The sound was brilliant.
And the sound was great. Yeah, it created its own uniqueness.
By the way, that's the Immaculate Fools album produced by John Davis.
Yes.
We need to go back and search that online somewhere.
Yes, Another Man's World. That was the album. But 6 months later, I was in Tokyo doing a soundtrack. And I was sitting in this magnificent studio, like it was the Dogs. And I had every piece of kit that you could possibly want, really expensive stuff. I was totally overwhelmed. I was plugging everything in. And then the result at the end was meh. Because I wasn't
It didn't have any
creative.
balls. It didn't have any sort of spice. It didn't have any...
I wasn't working it.
Well,
I was just kind of...
So this is exactly this point, right? Is that the young Chinese... So we heard the story, the origin story of this company.
Yeah.
It was a hedge fund. A bit like, do you remember, I think you might have remembered, we spoke with Michael Lewis about a company called Jane Street Research, which was a quantitative hedge fund, which our friend Freud worked for.
Yeah.
Okay. And so imagine a company like that, full of quants, full of mathematicians. You take that brain power and you say, look, yeah, it's very interesting making a tiny, tiny margin on a massive trade, and then we all make loads of money. Not that interesting. Why don't we take this brain power and spin off within the company a little AI division of mathematicians, technologists, and let them do what we think they can do, but we don't have the resources. So we've got a few million quid.
Yeah.
Not 100 million, a few million quid.
Yeah.
So if we lose, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't destroy the business, but if we gain.
Yeah.
And exactly like you in Shropshire, you're actually taking, okay, I have these mics, I have this.
Problem solving.
I have this. Exactly.
Yeah.
And humans are at their best when we're solving problems.
Absolutely.
And the problem is...
And most creative.
If you throw lots of money in it, you don't come up with any solutions because there's no urgency. Yeah. You're like, well, if I screw it up today, we'll still have 10 million quid tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think And we conclude here. This story tells us about geopolitics, tells us about economics, it tells us about innovation, and it reinforces one of the podcast's overall themes for the last 5 years is the economics of Joseph Schumpeter. That this is a fantastic example of the gales of creative destruction, except the gales of creative destruction are blowing in the very region, Silicon Valley, where they felt they were protected from them, and they're not.
America's second.